Hello everybody. Today we'll talk about a very important structure of the nervous system, which is the spinal cord. You all know that two structures belong to the central nervous system, or CNS, the brain and the spinal cord. So today we will talk about the spinal cord. First we'll talk about the anatomy of the spinal cord. Then we'll talk about the external features. What are the structures you can see from outside. Then we'll talk about the spinal nerves. 31 pairs of nerves arise from both sides of the spinal cord. Those are called the spinal nerves. We'll see how the spinal nerves are formed. Then we'll talk about two types of tracts. Tracts are the bundles of fibers inside the spinal cord, ascending tracts and descending tracts. And then we'll talk about the relay of signal. When the sensory signal goes towards the brain in different locations, the signal is relayed. That means one group of neurons give signal or transfer signal to another set of neurons. And we'll see also the descending pathway. Then we'll talk about the spinal cord trauma to the spinal cord. So first we'll see the location of the spinal cord. If you see the spinal cord, the upper end of the spinal cord is at the level of the foramen magnum. You remember in the bottom of the skull, in the occipital bone, there is a large foramen called the foramen magnum. Foramen magnum. Okay, and that is the upper level of the spinal cord, or the starting of the spinal cord. And you know that brainstem is located in the bottom of the brain, and brainstem has three parts, right? Midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. So spinal cord starts from the lower end of the medulla oblongata, okay, and goes down like this all the way to the lumbar 1 vertebrae, L1. And the spinal cord is located inside the vertebral column. Inside the vertebral column, there is a canal called the vertebral canal. So it is located inside the vertebral canal, or passes through the vertebral canal. Now, if you see the lower end of the spinal cord, most of the cases the lower end ends at lumbar 1 vertebral level. Sometimes it goes a little bit more down to L2, or lumbar 2. Lower end of the spinal cord is cone shaped, and that cone shaped part is called the conus medullaris. Okay, conus medullaris. The size of the spinal cord, if you see the spinal cord length of the spinal cord, it is about 18 inches in adult person, which is 45 centimeter long, and 12 inches, half inch wide. That means 14 millimeter wide. Okay. The function. If you see inside the spinal cord, you have bundle of fibers or tracts. Some tracts carry the signal towards the brain. These are called the ascending tracts. Ascending tracts. Okay. Ascending tracts are also called sensory tracts. because sensory signals are taken to the brain. For example, pain, touch, temperature, your vision or sight, your hearing, smell, all those are sensory signals travel to the brain. So ascending or sensory pathway. Okay, and there are some tracts or bundle of fibers that take the signal out from the brain, away from the brain. These are called the descending tracts or motor tracts. Motor or descending tracts or pathway. So now we can say that spinal cord provides two-way communication upwards and downwards. Okay, now we'll see the protection of the spinal cord. Like your brain, spinal cord is also a very important structure, and it should be heavily protected. So if you see, as I have already mentioned, the spinal cord is located inside the vertebral column. Inside the vertebral column, you have a canal called the vertebral canal. Vertebral canal. And inside the vertebral canal, you have the spinal cord. So if you see from outside to inside, the outermost structure is the bone. Which bone? Vertebrae. And then under the bone, you have a layer of fat in the epidural space. That means outside of the dura mater. This is the dura mater, and this is the epidural space containing fats. So that is the second protection. And then you have the dura mater, the thickest layer of meninges. In the meninges there are three layers. You have learned from the brain. Outermost is the dura mater, and then you have the arachnoid mater, and then the pia mater. Pia mater is the innermost and thinnest one, which is directly attached to the surface of the spinal cord here. Okay, and in subarachnoid space, that means between the arachnoid and pia mater, here you have the cerebrospinal fluid. In subarachnoid space, you have the cerebrospinal fluid. That is also a protection to the spinal cord. And now remember one thing, that around the spinal cord you have the fat in the epidural space, but around the brain you don't have this protection. You don't have any fat in the epidural space. Only around the spinal cord you have the epidural fat. Now this is the spinal cord inside, and outer part is the white matter, and inner part, which looks like a butterfly, is a gray matter. Okay, so outer white matter, inner gray matter. Now external features of the spinal cord. If you see the structure of the spinal cord from outside, the spinal cord this is the spinal cord. In two locations, the spinal cord is expanded or wider. So this is the spinal cord. in two locations the spinal cord is expanded like this, also here. Those are called enlargements. One is at the cervical part, your neck area. So this is called the cervical enlargement. Cervical enlargement. And another enlargement or expansion is in the lumbar area. So that is lumbar enlargement. Okay, so those are two enlargements in the spinal cord. Why you have in those two areas the spinal cord is wider. Wider means you have more neurons in these areas. Why? Because from the upper limbs, from your arms, the nerves enter into that area. That means the nerves that go to the upper limbs are bringing signal or taking the signal from out from this area. That's why in this area you need more neurons to receive or send the signal. So you have enlarged part in the cervical area. Why in the lumbar area you have enlargement? Because from the lower limbs, your legs, large nerves bring the signal here or take the signal out from here. So you need more neurons in those areas. Make sense? So that's why you have two enlargements in the spinal cord. Anyway, now the lower cone-shaped part of the spinal cord is called conus medullaris. Okay, and from the conus medullaris, the pointed tip of the conus medullaris, a cord-like, thin cord-like structure goes down. That is called phylum terminale. Phylum terminale. Okay, and that phylum terminale ties the lower end of the spinal cord to the coccyx, the tailbone. Okay, so the lower end won't move. The spinal cord will not be able to move up or sideways. So just tie the lower end to the bone coccyx, so it will stay in right location inside the vertebral canal. Then from the lower cone-shaped part of the spinal cord, a bunch of spinal nerve roots arise, and they form a bunch of spinal nerve roots here, and it looks like a horse tail, and that horse tail like structure is called chordae equine. Chordae equine means horse tail shaped part. So those are few structures you see at the lower end of the spinal cord. Then if you see the outer surface of the spinal cord, you have the pia mater, right, attached to the spinal cord, innermost meninges. So this is the pia mater here, outermost outer surface of the spinal cord is covered by pia mater, which is the innermost meninges. And then you have arachnoid matter here, and then the thickest one is the dura mater. Those are three meninges, right? So this is the dura. So dura matter. Now what happens? From the pia mater, ligaments arise and pass through the arachnoid and go to the dura mater. Those ligaments are also present in this side. This is the dura mater, okay? And from pia, those ligaments arise. And these are called denticulate ligaments. Denticulate ligaments. Okay, so they also hold the spinal cord in right location, would prevent the movement of the spinal cord when we move our body parts. So those are the structures, external structures of the spinal cord. So here you can see enlargement in this part, cervical part. Here also another enlargement here, that is the thoracic lumbar enlargement here, and you see the lower cone-shaped end, that's the conus medullaris, bunch of spinal nerve roots, chordae equinae. Okay, this is the coccyx bone, and this is the filum terminale. See the green one, this line is the filum terminale. It's a thin cord that ties the lower end to the coccyx. Okay, and denticulate ligaments. Lumbar puncture is a method or a procedure to collect the cerebrospinal fluid from the subarachnoid space. And lumbar puncture is done at a level of L4, L5, lower lumbar. So we do lumbar puncture at lower lumbar areas between L3 to L5. Why? You know that the spinal cord ends at lumbar 1. So spinal cord ends, this is T12, this is lumbar 1. Most of the cases ends at lumbar 1. Sometimes it goes down to lumbar 2, but it won't go below that. So this area is safe. L3, 4, 5, we can do lumbar puncture here because the covering meninges continues down. So although no spinal cord is here, but you have the dura arachnoid, right, and subarachnoid space, you have the cerebrospinal fluid in subarachnoid space. So what we do, we insert needle, long needle, through the back of the vertebral column and collect the cerebrospinal fluid from the subarachnoid space. And this area is safe because this is lower lumbar, no spinal cord is in this area, but fluid is there. So without any chance of injuring the spinal cord, you can collect the cerebrospinal fluid. Now why you collect the cerebrospinal fluid? You collect the cerebrospinal fluid to culture to see if there is any microorganism is there or if any blood is there. If any infection occurs in the central nervous system in your brain or the spinal cord, then that microorganism will float in the cerebrospinal fluid. So you can do culture and see if any microorganism is there and what kind of microorganism. For example, if meningitis occurs, right, you would like to find the microorganism in the cerebrospinal fluid to be confirmed. Also, if any internal hemorrhage or bleeding occurs in the central nervous system, in your brain or the spinal cord, you will be able to find the trace of blood in the cerebrospinal fluid, because cerebrospinal fluid circulates around the brain and the spinal cord, right? So even injury is in your brain area, you will find the trace of blood in the cerebrospinal fluid here. So we ask the patient to lie down sideways and curve the upper part of the body, turn the upper part of the body forward. So you get more space between the spinous process of the vertebrae, uh, open space, and you can insert the needle through that open area. The formation of the spinal nerve. This is a cross section of the spinal cord, and these are the spinal nerves. So what happens, the spinal nerve actually are present in both sides of the spinal cord, and let me show you here. uh, this is a cross section of the spinal cord. Okay, and inside the spinal cord, I mentioned before, inner part is the gray matter. So now I'm drawing that butterfly shaped part, which is the gray matter, and the outer part is the white matter. So this is white matter here, white matter, and this part is the gray matter. Okay, uh, gray matter. So white matter, and this is the gray matter. Okay, and in each half of the gray matter there is a central canal in the center here, central canal, and in each half of the gray matter you have three horns. If this is the front, this is ventral, and this is dorsal or back. Okay, so there are three horns. You see one ventral horn, dorsal horn, lateral horn. So this is ventral horn, this is lateral horn, and this one is dorsal horn. So in each side of the gray matter you have three horns. Same thing here, ventral horn here, lateral horn, and dorsal horn. In ventral horn you have motor neurons. So inside the ventral horn you have motor neurons. In the dorsal horn here, these neurons are sensory neurons. Sensory neurons. And in the lateral horn here you have autonomic neurons. Okay, so three types of neurons are present in three horns. Okay, now what happens, this is your body wall. Okay, muscle, muscle, and skin. Okay, so now just think that these neurons in the ventral horn are motor neurons, right? So from these neurons, the axons come out, and these axons group together, bundle together to form the ventral root. So this is called ventral root, bundle of motor axons or motor fibers here. And these are sensory neurons in the dorsal horn, so the axons of these neurons also, because many neurons are there and each neuron has an axon, so they bundle together to form a root that is called the dorsal root. Dorsal root. Dorsal root. So there are two roots, right? Ventral root is attached to the ventral horn, dorsal root or bundle of fibers attached to the dorsal horn. And you remember, dorsal horn neurons are sensory neurons, so this root is sensory root, and that means these fibers are sensory fibers. And ventral horn neurons are motor, so these fibers are motor fibers in the ventral root. And now the sensory, these are sensory and these are motor. These two roots, or the fibers inside the roots, they join together to form the spinal nerve. So this is the spinal nerve. Spinal nerve. So you see how the spinal nerve is formed by the union or meeting of the ventral root and dorsal root. And ventral root again contains the sensory motor fibers, and dorsal root contains the sensory fibers. Now sensory and motor roots join together to form the spinal nerve. So we can say that spinal nerve is a mixed type nerve because it has both sensory and motor fibers. Okay, so spinal nerve is a mixed type nerve. Okay, mixed type nerve, and it is a very short. You see, only this part is the spinal nerve. This is ventral root, dorsal root. They join together to form the spinal nerve. In this side, same, ventral root, dorsal root join together to form the spinal nerve here. And then the spinal nerve divides into two branches. So let's see here, spinal nerve divides into two branches. This is the big one and this is the smaller one. Okay, and these are called rami. This is ventral ramus is singular, ventral ramus, and this is smaller one or thin one is dorsal ramus, together called rami. And since the spinal nerve here is formed by the sensory and motor fibers, when the spinal nerve splits, in both branches you have sensory and motor fibers. So the rami have both sensory and motor, but roots have one. Ventral root has the motor, dorsal root has the sensory. So that is the difference. In ramus you have both sensory and motor. In root you have one type, one of those two. And that's why formation of spinal nerve is very important. If they don't join two roots together, then the sensory and motor fibers will not get united. So after the spinal nerve is formed, then when it splits to form the rami, both rami have sensory and motor, and they go to the body wall. And now it makes sense. The motor fibers will go to the muscles and sensory fibers will go to the skin. This is the back of the body. This is the front part of the body wall. Okay. So now both ventral and dorsal rami have sensory and motor. So your muscles and skin will get the signal, both types of signal. Now, if just think that you didn't have the spinal nerve formation, your body wall was here, then what would have happened? The front part would get only the motor, that means only movement, no sensation. The back part only gets sensory, that means you have sensation but no movement or motor. That should not happen, right? So that is why spinal nerve formation is very important. So three horns. Okay, so here the same thing that I explained. You see, this is the gray matter, and you have ventral horn, lateral horn, dorsal horn. Okay, and sensory fibers from the ventral root, and motor fibers from the ventral root, sensory fibers from the dorsal root. So this is dorsal root, this is ventral root, motor, sensory, and they join together to form a mixed spinal nerve. Okay, and then spinal nerve divides into two ramus. The ventral one is bigger, dorsal one is smaller, but both have both sensory and motor fibers. Okay, now one thing that I didn't mention before, in dorsal root you will find a kind of round structure here that is called dorsal root ganglion. You have sensory neurons inside the dorsal root ganglion. So sensory neurons. So when I touch, this is the skin. When I touch the skin from the receptors, sensory signal goes this way, right? And these neurons receive the signal. And then from these neurons, the fibers go to the dorsal horn, which is the house for sensory neurons. Okay, so always remember, since this is sensory, dorsal is sensory, signal goes to the spinal cord, sensory is taken towards the spinal cord and brain, and this is motor, so signal goes to the muscle this way. So touch, pain, temperature, if I touch, signal will go this way, and then from here to the brain. And if I decide to move something, body part from the brain, the signal will come here, and then from these motor neurons will go to the muscle. Okay, so ventral root carries the signal outwards, dorsal root carries the signal inwards. This is sensory, this is motor. Okay, now the white matter, the outer part of the spinal cord. In the white matter, you have the tracts, bundles of fibers, and those fibers are myelinated. That's why look white. So you see here in the white matter, you have two types of fibers shown by red and blue colors. Okay, blue tracts or fibers are ascending or sensory. So here the blue are, you must remember at the beginning I said that there are two types of tracts, ascending or sensory and descending or motor. Right, so here the red tracts are motor and blue tracts are sensory. So we'll just see few important tracts. Those are very important in the white matter. You see this one and this one, we will see one half, other half is same. So this one and this one, these two are called spinothalamic tract. That means goes from the spinal cord to the thalamus of the brain. That, makes sense, since it is ascending or sensory, will go to the thalamus of the brain. So spinothalamic, this is called ventral. Spinothalamic, this is called lateral. In this side you have same ventral and lateral. And just know that spinothalamic tract carries pain and temperature, those two types of signals. Then you have spinocerebellar. This is ventral spinocerebellar, that means from the spinal cord to the cerebellum of the brain. And this is dorsal. So ventral in the front, dorsal in the back. And spinocerebellar tracts carry the body position signal. And you must remember that cerebellum is the structure in the brain which is responsible for the balance and equilibrium. So these spinocerebellar tracts carry the body position signal because to maintain the body position, your cerebellum needs the position or location of your body parts or body um, uh, at any moment. Okay, so those are the spinocerebellar. Now in the back you see you have fasciculus cuneus and fasciculus gracilis. These are also sensory. And what are the functions of the fasciculus cuneus and fasciculus gracilis? They carry the signal of touch, deep touch. Okay, or pressure. Okay, so those are the important sensory or ascending tracts. Now we will talk about the motor tracts. Motor tracts are shown by the red colors here, red colored tracts, and motor are descending tracts, so carry the signal from the brain to the muscles or glands of the body. And the most important motor tract is this one, cortico-spinal tract. This is called the corticospinal tract here, ventral corticospinal tract and lateral corticospinal tract. And corticospinal tracts are the tracts that take the signal from the brain to the skeletal muscles. So the body movement is mainly controlled by the corticospinal. That signal comes through the corticospinal tract. Corticospinal tract is also called pyramidal tract. Okay, so pyramidal tract, and this is the main motor tract, goes to the skeletal muscles. Okay, to help the movement of the body parts. Other motor tracts are you see rubrospinal tract, vestibulospinal tract, reticulospinal tract. So those are other motor tracts. Now, one thing, if you remember, it would be easy. Most of the sensory or descending sensory or motor tracts start with um, anything but ends with spinal. So you see cortico-spinal motor, reticulo-spinal, rubro-spinal. Okay, there is another called vestibulo-spinal. So all these are motor and end with spinal, originate from different parts of the brain and ends in the spinal cord. That's why end with spinal. These are motor, and most of the sensory start with spino. For example, spinothalamic starts with spino, spinocerebellar. Make sense? Except these two, fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus. Okay, so those are the tracts, ascending or sensory, descending or motor tracts, located in the white matter of the spinal cord. uh, in the ascending pathway, the signal is relayed in 3 locations. If I touch your skin here, you have the receptors, touch receptors, pain receptors, temperature receptors are present in the skin, that. So if I touch, then the receptors, touch receptors will be activated, right, and will send signal. Since this is sensory signal, will go through the spinal nerve. Here is a spinal nerve, and then will be received by the neurons in the ganglion. This is the dorsal root ganglion. You must remember this. I showed you in last slide. Dorsal root ganglion, because it is in the dorsal root. That's why ganglion is the round structure filled with the cells or neurons in the peripheral nervous system. If it is in the peripheral nervous system, that round structure filled with the cell bodies, those are called ganglion. If they are in the central in the brain, those or central nervous system, those are called nuclei. Anyway, so these neurons will receive signal. So these are the first order neurons. First order. So first the signal will be received by these neurons, and then these neurons will give signal to another group of neurons. You must remember in the dorsal horn, sensory neurons, these are also sensory neurons, right? So these are second order neurons. Second order neurons. Okay, so first order neurons are in the dorsal root ganglion, sensory neurons. Second order sensory neurons are in the dorsal horn of the spinal gray matter. And then from these neurons, the signal will go all the way to the thalamus. Thalamus is the major sensory relay station, you know that. So most of the sensory signals are taken to the thalamus. So from here, it will travel a long way to the thalamus in most of the cases. So in the thalamus, you have the third order neurons. This is the continuation of that picture. So the sensory fibers are going to the thalamus here. where you have the third order neurons. Okay, and then from the thalamus, this signals send signal to the somatosensory cortex, the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay, so those are three relay stations for most of the sensory signals. Okay, dorsal root ganglion. Let's go back. Dorsal root ganglion, first order neurons. First relay takes place here. Then dorsal horn, another group of sensory neurons. Second order neurons, and then uh, in the thalamus you have the third order neurons here. Okay, now uh, descending or motor. So after your brain receives the sensory information, brain will decide, integrate, right? So the integration occurs in the brain, the processing, interpretation, analyzing those things, and then uh, the motor area of the brain or motor cortex uh, sends signal to execute the command. If your brain thinks that, after interpreting that sensory signal, if the brain thinks that a motor command should go to the muscle to move the hand away, then the motor cortex, primary motor cortex, is here. So these neurons here, this is another, these neurons in the primary motor cortex, this is primary motor cortex here, and in this side here. So primary motor cortex uh, has the motor neurons, and these neurons will send signal all the way down to where? To the ventral horn. You must remember, in the ventral horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord, you have the motor neurons, right? So these motor neurons will receive the signal, and through the ventral root, spinal nerve, and the ramus, the signal will go to the effector organ, which is the muscle, to move the hand. So you see that the motor pathway has two sets of neurons, only two. The upper motor neurons are in the primary motor cortex here, and from their long axon or fiber goes all the way down to the spinal cord ventral horn, where you have another set of motor neurons. These are called lower motor neurons. Makes sense? Upper motor neurons in the brain, lower motor neurons in the spinal cord. And then from the motor neurons, ventral root is for the motor, right? Through the spinal nerve will go to the muscle. So in motor pathway you have upper and lower motor neurons. Okay. Now one thing is, see, if the upper motor neurons are here in the primary primary motor cortex, so this is the primary motor cortex. These are the motor neurons, upper motor neurons. Neurons, and from there, this is the spinal cord, ventral horn, lateral horn, dorsal horn. Okay, so here in the spinal cord, spinal cord, gray matter in the ventral horn. This is the ventral horn. You have another group of motor neurons, right? So these are upper motor neurons, these are lower motor neurons. In the ventral horn of the spinal cord. So these neurons send signal to these neurons. Now something interesting, these neurons send signal to the muscles. So this is the muscle. Okay. Now remember, lower motor neurons always try to contract the muscle forcefully, strongly. So lower motor neurons try to contract the muscle forcefully. Works too much, hyper. And upper motor neurons are always sending signal to the lower motor neurons and telling them, don't contract the muscle too strongly. So inhibition is going from the upper motor neurons to the lower motor neurons. Now, if any lesion like a stroke or brain damage occurs, upper motor neurons are destroyed. Then what will happen? Inhibition will not go to the lower motor neurons. Nobody is now inhibiting the lower motor neurons. So lower motor neurons will get freedom, right? So we'll contract the muscles very strongly. So the muscles will remain in contractile condition. That is called spastic paralysis. Spastic paralysis. Strong muscle spasm. Spasm of the muscle. Muscle is in stiff condition, will not relax if upper motor neurons are damaged or destroyed. Now, if upper motor neurons are fine, but lower motor neurons are destroyed, then what will happen? No strong contraction will go to the signal, will go to the muscle. So muscles will remain very relaxed and will not be able to contract. The muscle tone will be lost, okay, if no signal goes from the lower motor neurons to the muscles, and that is called flaccid type paralysis. Okay, so here spasm, here loss of muscle tone, no muscle tone, muscle will not contract, so the person will not be able to move. So those are two types of paralysis can occur due to upper and lower motor neuron lesion or damage. Okay, so you see here flaccid and spastic paralysis. Trauma to the spinal cord injury can cause some disabilities of movement or paralysis, paraplegia, quadriplegia, and hemiplegia. Paraplegia, if transection or injury occurs in the spinal cord between thoracic 1 to lumbar 1, that means mostly in the thoracic part of the spinal cord. So where the transection occurs or injury occurs, the body part below that will be paralyzed. That makes sense. That part will be dissected from getting the signal from the brain, right? So if this is your head, this is the neck, okay, and the trunk, upper limbs, the trunk, the upper limbs, lower limbs. Okay. So, so this is the head part of the body. This is the neck. So you see, this is the chest or thorax. So if anywhere between thoracic 1, T1 to lumbar 1, L1, injury occurs, the spinal cord is damaged here, for example, then the body part below that will be paralyzed. So the trunk and the lower limbs will be paralyzed, but upper limbs will stay, unaffected, will stay unaffected. So if here, same thing, the lower part of the trunk and the lower limbs, legs will be paralyzed, and that is called paraplegia. Trunk and lower limbs. Now if transection occurs in cervical here, part of the spinal cord, then what will happen? All four limbs, right, as well as the trunk will be paralyzed. So that is called quadriplegia. Quadri means four. Here all four limbs are paralyzed, right, including the trunk. So that's why it is called quadriplegia. Okay, transection in the cervical part or neck part. Hemiplegia, if one side of the body, partly or completely, one side, part of one side or whole one side of the body is paralyzed, that is hemiplegia. That can occur due to also stroke in the brain or injury to one side of the spinal cord. This person, many people know him. He was a famous superstar, Christopher Reeve. He fell off the horse from his horse and broke the neck. So he had damage or transection of the spinal cord in the cervical part. So he got quadriplegia, and he probably some of you have seen him sitting on the wheelchair rest of the life and died. Reflex, we talked about the reflex before. To be reflex, three things must be maintained. One is the response should be very fast, quick response, right, immediate, and the response should be involuntary or autonomic. If you get the stimulus and voluntarily move the body, that is not a reflex. But if I hit your patellar ligament with a hammer, your leg kicks forward automatically, as involuntarily. That is a reflex, not voluntary movement. Okay, so must be quick response, must be autonomic or involuntary, and then same way, the response should be same response. Every time I hit, the leg kicks forward, not backwards, right? Every time I put flashlight on your eye, pupil constricts. So you don't do that, it happens by itself. So autonomic and same response. So those are the three conditions of reflex. To be a condition, to be a reflex, these conditions must be there. Okay. Now the reflex arc, the pathway from the beginning to the end, is called the reflex arc. So first, like if something very hot touches your skin, you have temperature receptors, right, and touch receptors. The receptors are activated first. So activation of receptors. Then from the receptors, the signal, this is the dorsal root. So this is sensory, right? So sensory nerves will take the signal to the dorsal horn sensory neurons here. Okay, so activation of sensory neurons. Then spinal cord will process that signal. So this is the integration or information processing in the central nervous system. Then signal will come here to in the ventral horn where you have the motor neurons. You must remember we talked about that a lot. So these motor neurons will receive signal from the sensory neurons and will send signal through the ventral root where you have the motor fibers or motor neurons, and this is the effector. The muscle is the effector, number 5. So receptors, number 1, number 2 the sensory neurons, number 3 the spinal cord integration, number 4 motor neurons will be activated, and number 5 the effector will perform the action. So those are 5 components. Those are called the components of reflex or part of the reflex arc. Okay, reflex arc. So those are the things you need to know from the spinal cord. Now spinal cord processes some reflex. One I mentioned is the knee jerk or patellar reflex. If I hit your patellar ligament, signal goes to the spinal cord and comes back to the leg muscle. So that is a reflex controlled by the spinal cord. Another reflex is called the plantar reflex. The sole of the foot is scratched by something blunt. Okay, and you start from the heel and move forward along the lateral side of the sole of the foot. So like this, scratch, and then from a small toe you will move this way towards the root of the big toe, and that is the direction of movement. Okay, so you will scratch with something blunt this way and see how the toes respond. So if you see that the toes are moving downwards, that means the flexion of the toes. Okay, that is normal. Plantar reflex, that is normal. So this is normal. So the person's motor function or sensory motor integration is normal. Now if you scratch the sole of the foot and see the extension of the toe and fanning of the big toe, that means spreading of the big toe and extension, that means that reflex is not present. And if no plantar reflex is present, you will see the extension of the toes and fanning of the toes or spreading of the toes, and that means Babinski's sign is positive. This is called Babinski's sign. And if Babinski's sign is positive, that indicates that person might have a problem in the motor neuron or motor processing or sensory motor integration, that means motor neuron disease. However, if you test this plantar reflex in an infant, very small, like first 2 years of life, you will see Babinski's sign is positive, although the baby is healthy. It's not a defect, because you know that after birth it takes a couple of years to develop the motor function. That's why, you know, immediately after birth the babies cannot, you know, walk or stand or sit or maintain the balance of the body, because their motor functions are still being processed, being developed, not yet matured. So if motor system is not matured, then you should see the Babinski's sign positive. So that is nothing abnormal. You should not take the baby to the doctor. Okay. Okay, so that's all about the spinal cord.